So welcome everybody to this first iPEN webinar for 2024 around flexibility in funding and how that can support the delivery of impact from research. And we're really looking forward to hearing from Aaron McGlinchey from National Science Challenge, New Zealand's Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, and Ross Lawrence, who is the iPEN Chair and also from Manaaki Whenua. I'll open with a karakia and then I will hand over to the two of them to do their introductions. Aaron will be going first and then Ross will be following. Kia ora te marino, kia whakapapa pōnamu te moana. Hei huri ahun mātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu aroha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. Hui e tai here. All right, well, yes, welcome all. Really looking forward to this conversation, as many of you are. So Aaron, I'm going to hand straight over to you. I'll stop sharing my screen and yeah, if you can introduce yourself, and we'll look forward to hearing about the experience from the National Science Challenge.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou everybody, ko Aaron McGlinchey toko ingoa. I'm the Operations Manager for the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge. Hopefully you can now see my screen. Someone give me a thumbs up. Good, thank you.
All good.
Okay, so I'll crack on with just a little bit of background for a start. So there are 11 National Science Challenges. They were established in 2014, mission-led, and they were funded in 2 tranches, first 5 years and then the second 5 years. We are hosted in Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, and we have 18 challenge parties covering all the CRIs, the universities, Cawthron Institute, DOC and MPI, and then we've got a lot of independent researchers also involved in our research teams. So our mission is up here in the corner to reverse the decline of New Zealand's biological heritage, and we're structured under 3 impact areas: empower, protect, restore, which I think are pretty self-explanatory themes for an environmentally based challenge. This comes from our strategy. It just sort of captures the way that we look at the science system, recognizing that there's a diversity of contributions from a range of individuals. Can you see my mouse if I do that? Yeah, you can. So we've got down at this end, there's more discovery science, through to this end where it's more applying the results of the research and getting impact and benefit. And they're all interwoven strands, lots of people contributing different parts across this pathway. And someone sort of misquoted Isaac Newton when they were talking about this, and that research stands on the shoulders of others. And so the further you are along this end, the more shoulders you're standing on, because you're building on all of the work that people have done way back at this discovery phase and through the other stages. In tranche 1, we ran a fairly standard sort of MB style of contract. It had lots of details of milestones 4 or 5 years into the future. And in tranche 2, we wanted to do things differently, because we found that in tranche 1, even though we stressed to the teams that, you know, we're flexible, you can come and talk to us about changing things if things change, by and large, they pretty much stuck to their plan. Well, that's what they set out to do at the start, and that was pretty much the path that they followed right through to the end. So we wanted to try and be a bit more flexible and creative in tranche 2. So we looked at a whole lot of different sorts of contracts, and they're sort of popping up on the screen at the moment. They all had lots of different good ideas and good elements, but there were none of them that sort of we could just pick up and use in our scenario. So this last document, the grey one, that gave sort of a lot of good sort of background thinking that contributed to where we are now, I guess. And so there's a notion called relational contracting, and it's a formal contract, but it's more collaborative and more trust-based. And it's not a new idea. It dates back to the 60s. And back in the 60s, they had, you know, the old a man's word was a contract, and handshake deals and all that sort of thing. And by the way, the asterisk for a man's word is this is the 60s. And Of course, a woman's word is equally applicable, so don't tar and feather me for that. But about the same time, lawyers started to think, oh, we need to get more detail in our contracts and think about, well, if this scenario happens or that scenario happens, and it's all about managing risk. So it became a lot less trusting sort of scenario, if you like. And again, apologies to lawyers for that little cartoon. I love our lawyer, Kate. She's wonderful. So she's helped a lot in this process. So the lawyers wanted to get planning and detail into the contracts, but actually the research shows that we think we're we like to we're not actually very good at planning, but we think we're very good at planning. So we build detailed plans into our contracts, and potentially those plans are flawed, so you're possibly not going to end up with the best result. And there's research showing that, well, the research that we're doing, of course, brings in uncertainty. We don't research things that we already know the answers to. They're unknowns that we're trying to discover. So if you're building contracts out into the future, but the plans that you're building into those contracts are potentially flawed, you're not necessarily going to get the best results. And there are a number of situations that are shown that the relational style of contract will outperform a transactional contract. So with that in mind, we had a workshop with our challenge parties and talked about those documents I shared before. And end of the day, we decided that, well, we trust each other here, and we're actually happy with the legal clauses you've already got in place. So why don't we just split out the legal part from the detailed research plans, recognizing that that's the bit that's a bit more dynamic and unknown. Oh, where are we? And at the end of tranche 2, so that we could direct the research into the questions that we want to answer, we had a big scoping process, and it took a lot longer than we thought, but it was a very worthwhile process. And just as an aside, it generated its own report and paper, and so there's the DOI to it there if you want to look it up. We got lots of people putting in expressions of interest, not just scientists. We were very broad in our call for people to take part, and we made it very clear to the people being involved that when you come into the scoping process, you put your hat at the door. You don't come in with your personal or your organisation's best interest at heart. It was thinking about what's best for New Zealand. And so we carefully selected people to be on those panels. And then each of them produced a report which helped identify the research priorities leading to tranche 2. And just as an aside, this nice little tweet about the paper I mentioned from a guy in Scotland I came across as I was preparing this talk, saying it's world-leading impact, so that's nice.
Yep.
This is just a quick summary of some statistics from the scoping process. I won't go into a lot of detail, but you can see we had 237 EOIs, picked 87 people. From the EOIs, that's the breakdown of the applications, that's the people that we ended up picking. So, you know, quite a range of organisations and backgrounds. A lot of time spent in Hui, a lot of time consulting with people outside of the core group. So it wasn't just a group of 8 or 10 people thinking what they thought. They went out and they were tasked with interviewing and in-depth discussions with lots of people to get a real picture of what were the key issues in the environmental research space that we covered. And so this diagram sums up the process and where we've got to. So we start out with a contract. We appoint co-leads. We've got a treaty-led model where we've got both a Māori and a non-Māori co-lead in most instances. So we agree the funding amount and the duration of the contract, and we give them some high-level direction on the research. And then we put that in the contract, and that's where we start from. And so those co-leads go and pull together the right team, and we use the term the right team as opposed to MB's term, the best team, because the best team in an MB view might be the very academically highly published researchers Whereas the right team to get the result that you want might involve, well, that probably does involve in most cases, a broader range of people to bring different skills to the table. And then the team, they go away and they develop up a first work plan with all the details. And the detail is there for the first year and has your regular sorts of milestones. And for the out years, they just put a few sort of placeholders showing the direction of travel that they're heading in and knowing that things might change. It's got budget, it's got phasing and all that sort of stuff. And that goes through a review process before it gets signed off. Excuse me, I just had a glass of water. So then they've got their detailed plan, it's signed off, it's been reviewed, and they progress to do the work. And then each March and April, they review the plan. So this is ahead of our annual financial year ending in June. They review it, they come back to us and say, oh, everything's going well, or this bit's not going quite so well. We've discovered this thing here, we'd actually like to change from doing that to this. And they have that flexibility. So then they flesh out the next 12 months in detail, adjust those placeholders that they've got going out to the future. If their revised plan is pretty minimal, it just continues on through, gets signed off, and they continue on the cycle. If there's more changes, and we've had one or two of our research teams did actually get to a point where they decided, you know what, this thing that we started off, this pathway we started off at the future is proving not to be the best path to follow. So we're going to take a step back and redirect where we put all our future effort and resources. And so that involved getting some further external review. But then again, they go through, the research continues, and then they just work through in this annual cycle. And each year we're pulling out information, reporting at MB, just as like Endeavour programs and the likes do. So the scoping process helped inform this stage of the contract, the process rather. It also helped us identify people who would potentially be good co-leads, had the right attitudes, could bring people together and form teams well. And if you think about it, that circle there on the left, that's a little bit like a traditional proposal, MB proposal, except we've sort of gone back and we've decided, well, we form the team and we pay them to do the proposal development in a sense. And then this right-hand side of the cycle, potentially something like that might work for MB platforms or SIP or SIF, which they currently do forward-looking plans anyway. So that would be something that they might want to think about. It could potentially fit into that sort of model. And so in our contract wording, it's acknowledging that the work plan is not going to be detailed before the contract is signed. So we're working on trust. They trust that we're going to follow through and pay them and approve the plan that they come up with. We're trusting that they're going to do a good job, develop an appropriate plan and all that sort of stuff. And when you think about it, we have a good reason to trust each other because researchers are actually got a high level of self-interest in doing a good job. They're not going to take the money and rest on their laurels. They want to do good science. They want to produce good outputs and papers and reports and engage with the end users and that sort of stuff. So there's really not a great deal of risk that I can see. If you've got a good relationship, trusting people in this model, well, we've certainly found that it works for us. And you'll see it refers to some operating principles and values. And in the challenge, we tried to have a bit of a different way of working in that it was more people-based, I guess, not so cold-hearted and transactional as the lawyers might have wanted us to be. And central to that and enabling us to work in the way that we're working is this one of our values is about trust. And I'll just let you read these next couple of screens. They're some feedback that we've had from a couple of our co-leads. So, Cara, when you've read it, give me the thumbs up and I'll go to the next one. This one's a bit longer. So I think you can see from those two examples that our co-leads have certainly embraced this new way and this new flexibility, and taken advantage of the opportunities to come back and tweak and adjust and just refocus their efforts depending on what they've learnt, because obviously you're learning as you're going along. And the old model, you sort of tended to just have your plan laid out in the front, and you might tweak and adjust a little bit, but it seemed to be, at least from our experience in tranche one, that they didn't seek to deviate too much from where they were originally setting course for. So to summarize, our approach seeks to trust and empower researchers, giving them the ability to adapt as they learn new things, trying to discourage a locked-in mindset of, that's what the contract says, so that's what we have to do, and encouraging them and enabling them to actually review and refine the approach and the direction, and think about, well, is this thing working or is it not working? Should we keep putting that amount of resource into this space, or should we shift resources to a more fruitful area of work, that sort of thing? And so I sort of say it's like shifting from a fortune teller mode of, making a plan with critical steps and milestones way out into the future, and then just following that plan as though you knew what was going to be the end result from the start, to a focus on your desired outcomes and enabling active planning and adapting, so that you've probably got the best chance of getting the outcome and impacts that you would like. And that is my talk. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. Where do I do that?
Kara, you're on mute.
Thought I turned it off. Obviously clicked it twice too quickly. Thanks, Aaron. If you haven't seen my note in the chat, we'll save questions until the very end so we can cover both Ross and Aaron's presentations together. And I've been muting myself because I have two dogs who both seem to keep seeing cats in the background. So I might shut them out in a moment. But otherwise, over to you, Ross.
Okay, we'll share my screen. Is that working for everyone? Okay. Thank you for having me, everyone. Ross Lawrence, I'm the Strategic Support Leader at Manaaki Whenua, Landcare Research, and I'm also happen to be the Chair of iPEN. So I'm just going to talk to you about our principles-based SIFT infrastructure contract. In my mind, the issues that Aaron has been talking about and introduced so well are fundamentally the ones that we've come across as well. But what we've done here, what I'm doing about to present on that, I think is quite a nice contrast to what Aaron has presented on. In the first instance, I'm taking a provider perspective rather than a funder perspective. And in the second instance, it's a little bit different in terms of it's not for a specific output or piece of research or body of research that this contract is about. It's about being custodians or delivering on a core piece of science infrastructure. So this is a strategic science investment fund contract, and it's really about how to look after that and get benefits from it. So I'll kind of go through this fairly quickly. So the aim's not to get you to kind of being able to go away and develop a contract like this yourself, but it's more about getting a feel, as Aaron's just given us, that there are different ways of doing things, and that there are solutions around some of the kind of systemic funding constraints, which we might want to talk a little bit about later, Kara. So just for a bit of background, I'm taking it as given everyone knows what the subcontracts are from MB, and that also people are fairly aware of what the nationally significant collections and databases are. in our case, we're responsible for 7 of them, and they kind of range from things like New Zealand's National Herbarium, which has got about 800,000 plus specimens, New Zealand's Fungarium, the arthropod collection, and we've also got things like land resource information systems. So there's kind of a swathe of those. And so we run a 5-yearly contract, or a contract lasts 5 years. Remember, that's the current pattern, and it money involves about $9 million per annum to look after those 7 collections and databases. We'll be custodians of them. And we recently renewed the contract, and we changed from what I call a traditional based contract, which is pretty much the stuff Aaron was talking about, to one we called a principles based contract. So I think it's quite, what I'm going to do is just to run you through kind of comparing the old contract to the new contract, just to give you a feeling for how things are different and how they work, and you'll probably start to see some themes come out as I go along. It's very similar to what Aaron talked about. Here we go. So, so at very high level, what do they look like? Well, the old contract was had kind of 7 sections, one for each collection or database. And each one of those sections or each collection database had its own priorities, its own capability listed, own statements around vision mātauranga and impact statements, how and who they're going to engage with. Went down to quite a level of detail, and each had its own resources allocated to it. In terms of detail, it might be like 0.01 of a person is allocated to this thing, and that was kind of in the contract. And each of its own KPIs and kind of little mini report, and it was 78 pages long. Whereas the new contract, it's just one set of principles that span all the nationally significant collections and databases. So it spans all 7 of them. It's not siloing things. And each of the principles, which I'll talk about in a minute, has its own work plan. And it's really enabling our strategy a lot too, because it takes a collective approach to resources and how we monitor and manage them. And it's only 34 pages long, which is just from a purely administrative perspective, a lot nicer. I'd kind of at high level, I'd describe the old contract as outputs focused. Again, that kind of fits in with what Aaron's just been telling us, whereas the new contract is focused on actually stewardship of the collections and databases, actually generating the impact and outcomes we want. So, well, what actually are principles? Well, they set a standard for where we want the collections and databases to be at, in terms of how well they're managed over the long term, and also the kind of the value expectations and the value and benefits they'll provide for New Zealand. So you'll see in there that bit of wording there that starts with, in the first 3 bullet points, Manaaki Whenua will invest to protect, maintain and enhance our portfolio of collections and databases in accordance with the following key principles. So that's really is the kind of the core of the contract. And those principles are about being committed to upholding Te Treaty and actually producing benefits for New Zealand. I kind of loosely refer to them of the why we've got this contract. And the third principle is about being strategic and responsive. So that's giving us that flexibility to deliver in a shifting environment on shifting priorities. And it provides a direction of travel. So it's making sure we stay strategic. And then the final 4 principles are really the fundamental things we need to be delivering on to keep the ship running and deliver and really act as curators and deliver on the benefits. So it's about keeping them reliable and secure as you'd imagine, making sure they're accessible and usable, so you can actually get to the collections and databases of information and use them. Really pointing out that actually they're part of a national and international infrastructure. So it's really, really critical that they're we work in a very collaborative way, and we're well connected with international infrastructure, and the critical capability underneath them is really fundamental to getting value from them. So that's the principles themselves, which I'll talk about. I'll delve into one or two in a second. Really carefully constructed. There's a lot of nuance in them, and myself and others learned a whole lot through going through the development of them, and that was a huge benefit in its own right. One thing I would say too about the principles is it quickly became apparent that to achieve these principles is a journey. So we're not funded to deliver a set of outputs as such. We don't have the current funding, and also we're in a shifting environment to actually deliver on those as it stands, if we were to do those things perfectly well. And some of the things are still evolving, like how do we commit to upholding teacherarity with collections and databases. So it's kind of a changing environment. So what we're funded for, what we're contracted for, is to go on the journey and take our best endeavours to achieve or to work to these principles. So let's just have a quick deep dive into a couple of them. So the first principle is being beneficial to New Zealand. It's quite interesting developing this principle and discussing it with internally, and both with MB as our funder. I think it brought out a lot of recognition of understanding from both sides of the ledger of the nature of the benefits we're trying to provide. Certainly wider in scope than most people imagined, including myself. And it's certainly led to greater mutual understanding of the scope and the purpose and the value of the collections and databases. You'll see some of the words I've highlighted there. It really recognises that being part of infrastructure, they're enablers of benefits. So they provide some direct benefits, but generally speaking, they're an enabler of benefits that others generate. Also, it recognises that they're a real long-term investment, and it's got that intergenerational investment component in there. And in that actually we can't value it as such now because there's a lot of unknown potential future uses of this sort of information. And also something that was kind of little known outside of the people who are really close to the collections and databases themselves is it actually they support a lot of New Zealand's international agreements. So just being able to bring this sort of realisation and understanding out into a contract has been was hugely useful in itself. And I'll kind of speak back to this a little bit later. Another one I thought would be interesting to show you is around curated, reliable and secure, what's behind that principle. And it's about security, managing to the best practice and standards. So it's not setting the standards, it's saying you're going to manage to them, which makes this contract a lot more flexible and adaptive over time. And another really key interesting thing is that with the way the contract developed, we actually realised that it was becoming more and more about risk being actively understood and managed together with MB. So it's really brought in this whole kind of different picture of risk management, more focused around the collections and databases and the value they provide in themselves, rather than the risk of not meeting the contract per se or dealing with issues. And again, I just highlight that last point there, because there was a lot of concern as we developed the contract internally that we were promising things that we couldn't deliver on. And here we once again acknowledge that it's a journey to which we will apply our best endeavours. And you'll probably see, I'll talk about it a little bit more later too. Aaron talked very much about the relationships and trust. So you'll see that as a really underpinning fundamental kind of requirement or philosophy behind this type of contracting as well. And finally, I'll just point out we had one around critical capability, and it really recognises that people are the key to success of the contract delivery. And again, that that those capability requirements change over time, and we need to be responsive to those changes. In the old contract, it used to define roles and numbers within the contract, FTEs within the roles. And so sometimes we'd have to do variations if we had 0.1 of a FTE or had to notify MB, moving around this or for that. But actually this again recognises the importance of critical capability to contract completion and how we should be keeping a real close eye on looking after it and managing the risk associated with it, and also about being able to have that flexibility and deliver on the core principles. So I think sometimes a good way to get a feel for what the difference between the contractors is to actually have a look at what the accountabilities or the KPIs are like. So I'm just going to delve into those quite briefly, and I hope they'll kind of give you a bit of a feeling. But first of all, very much taken the attitude that the principles and the KPIs for the principles are actually should be telling a collective story and give a level of assurance to both funder and provider that we're on track to delivering on contract, collectively delivering on the contract. And as such, they're actually now more focused on the health and improvement of our NSCDs themselves, rather than the performance of Manaaki Whenua in terms of producing actual outputs. So it's really shifted the focus to looking after the asset and getting the value from them, rather than from our organisational performance. And we actually want the KPIs to expose issues so that we can address them in partnership with the MB Māori and other stakeholders. So, in my mind, if a problem shows up in the KPIs, I view that as a very good thing, and I'd go use that as a great opportunity to go into discussion with the various stakeholders, and in particular MB the funder, of how can we mutually resolve that risk or that issue. And it's I think that's kind of a really key turnaround in what this contract's starting to look like, or looks like now. And also, again, we had a degree of uncomfortableness with people who are new to this type of thinking, or it's actually one of the things we kind of had to work through about acknowledging that some of the outcomes and benefits we're aiming towards, or many of them, aren't strictly in our control. So, for example, a benefit of an arthropod collection is actually probably as biosecurity, improved pre and post border biosecurity for New Zealand. But of course, we can't totally lay claim for that. We're just part of that system. So it's acknowledging that we can't be held accountable for those, but we want to fully recognise the part that the collections and databases play in their value. So let's have a little bit of a look at the old KPIs. So you can see here, looking down the columns, here's 4 of the 7 collections and databases involved, and we had a pattern of high-level KPIs where we had for each collection and database 2 ones nominally around the excellence pillar, which we in terms of what we could measure and things like that, were about adding specimens and about delivering services in a timely manner. So they are actually really important KPIs, and don't get me wrong, and they are still in the new KPIs, but not at that kind of level of detail. And then we each had a series of impact KPIs, a couple of impact KPIs each, and that was usually around any metrics we had around the number of users or visitors, and whether there were other metrics available around whether they're actually indeed been used for some of their key purposes, like underpinning a threat classification system, or number of citations in terms of being utilised for research. So we still have these, but these have been kind of combined into one or two individual, one KPI altogether, basically, one around excellence, one around impact. So what do new KPIs look like? Well, the KPIs are actually around the principles now, so they don't specify the individual collections and databases. So we've got the what they mean thing, but if you look at the 3rd column along, what's the actual KPI for whether the databases are curated, reliable and secure. Well, the KPI is actually around, are we actually managing all our collections and databases to the appropriate international operational policies and standards? Are they being managed and curated really, really well? Are we reviewing and recording that annually? So that tells us a whole lot about how well we're looking after them. And then we've these two KPIs around things like emergency and disaster plans, are they in place? And are we actually looking at the assessments of risk around them? So we're really taking a specific focus on managing the risk and making sure that the collections databases are really well held and reliable. And then, like I said earlier, it's really important to the collections and databases that we're working collaboratively, internationally and nationally. So we've actually put that in as a key principle, and obvious KPI is saying, well, are you actually managing, or are you holding those domestic and international collaborations? Are they still live and active? And just being able to say, yes, we can do that is a really good indicator of how well we're doing. And that's quite a contrast to that previous slide in terms of, what does this really tell us about the health of the databases and collections, and versus, in terms of us as a provider versus something like this in terms of the job we're doing. So I'm just down to my final two slides now. And these kind of more my reflections than anything else. So the key differences is a traditional contract, for me, it felt like it was more focused on outcome delivery, where now we're actually focused on steward and impact and the health of the collections and databases themselves. Our 7 NSCDs encouraged, I'd say, a more silo management approach. So it was actually, it created barriers to moving what's are fairly limited resources between bits of the business or bits of the overarching contract, whereas now actually the 7 principles are cut across the other way, like in a matrix, and it's how do we work on those to achieve the best outcome for the contract as a whole. And because of that very reason, it was the old contract was relatively inflexible, whereas this new contract really does help enable our strategy. And I always felt that reporting KPIs was about proving nothing's going too much wrong, because we'd all get into a bit of a fluster. If like, oh my God, we haven't met that KPI. Now it's like, oh, I'm not worried about that. Now it's like, okay, well, that's an interesting story. I can't wait to talk to MD about that. Just that key point around the level of reporting required. It's actually lifting things up so we discuss things that really matter. And also the old contract, it was very much felt like a state of play at that time. This is what we thought is the most important for New Zealand. This is what we think is the most important thing to do. Again, that links back to what Aaron's saying. You don't quite know the future. We don't know quite where things are going to take us. Gives us all that response that lets us be far more responsive, and also we can pay a lot more attention to risk. Final slide. That's where I kind of get into the slightly deeper reflections. It's really, MB were great partnerships when we came up, partners in terms of when we came up with this idea, and we're really supportive. And I give them a lot of kudos for stepping up and trying to do something a bit differently. I think it's working well so far. And it really feels more like now when I talk to them, we're in a kind of a partnership to achieve a commonly desired outcome. And that's a really nice place to be as a manager of that, or being part of the management of that. Also, I think it's actually created a lot more opportunity to better show how important the collections and databases are and why they're important, and to show their value. The KPIs, which I don't really have time to go into around the benefits, look quite different to some of the things you saw earlier. And I think are really important, all that sort of stuff, you put it together and it's actually creating different conversations around the management and the value and management of them, both internally, about what we're focusing on, what we're trying to achieve, and externally. And it's quite interesting just for the fact that the principles that have actually been listed in a contract has suddenly made it so people are paying attention to them. So you go to a partner, or you go to a whatever, and if you can say that that's been agreed in the contract, suddenly it gets a whole lot more attention than if you just say if that's really important. Don't know why that is, but will it improve our stewardship and impact? Well, I guess that's the bottom line. It's relatively early days. I certainly think it's helping widen the understanding and support for the collections and databases, both internally and externally. It's certainly giving us more flexibility to be responsive, and it's certainly letting us play with our strategy a lot more in terms of really getting value from the overarching investment. So kind of the second last thing I'd like to say is, you've heard from Aaron, and you heard from myself, and Aaron will probably want to comment on this shortly as well, is, okay, I'm talking about principles-based contract. Bioheritage is talking about different contracting model. You can see they're both kind of broadly in the same space, trying to address similar things. But is one more suitable than the other? I kind of think, well, it's like comparing to a spanner to a screwdriver. They're both really good things to have in your toolkit, and you pull out which one is the most appropriate at the time. I'm tending to think that the Bioheritage Challenge model is more applicable for a specific project or program of work. It can be quite long-term and big, but we're really trying to achieve a piece of research, whereas this principles-based contract is more of a long-term service or generalized research agreement towards broad goals, rather such as a SIF platform. But having said that, I think it's a kind of a spectrum, and there's probably a grey space in the middle where you can start to think about applying both these things, and it may be something that buys someone imagination hearing these two things talked about back to back. So my final thing is, funny enough, Aaron and I wrote these separately, but we ended up in the same place, that word trust. Trust is a key theme, and this, to my mind, this implies working at a higher level of trust and flexibility, and behind that you need really good communication and working in partnerships. And I think that what comes out of that is you're more likely to produce the right science, the right solutions, the right whatever. And also, just a little thing too is, so far we're finding that these contracts seem to be have a little bit less administration involved as well, which is kind of not the core purpose, but it's certainly a nice bonus from a administrative perspective. And one thing is kind of becoming clear with me too: with higher trust, you need higher transparency. Now, I wasn't really thinking that through at the time when we were developing this contract, but I think these models that both Aaron and I have talked about do actually create a far more transparent situation from both a funder and provider perspective about exactly what's happening when things are going on, exactly what you're agreeing to. And I think that's kind of a foundation of trust. You can't have trust without transparency. So it's kind of my final reflection around that. So I will finish sharing my screen.
Thanks,
hope that was
Ross.
okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's such an interesting comment that you finished on. And transparency is so vital when it comes to then like learning and improvement. So yeah, what a great, such a great reflection. We've got one question in the chat, but I did just want to offer one reflection. I think what both of you have done a really good job of is reminding us actually of it's that classic thing about, are the rules there to serve the people, or are the people there to serve the rules? Contracts are there, they were created to support things happening for us. And, Aaron, you were giving a good example of sort of how the cart got put before the horse a little bit in some respects historically. So I think it's always good to remember that these things are there to support and serve those intentions, as opposed to, we just have to follow the contract. So Aaron, there's a question from Richard in the chat, and I'll summarize. And just a reminder to people, if you've got any questions, either put them in the chat, or you're also welcome to take yourself off mute when we open up again. But Richard was saying, it seems to me, Aaron, that the approach to contracting you've described is similar to the SIF processes, where it's negotiated. It's more of a negotiated process annually with MB, rather than that big, very tightly nailed down long-term approach. Have you got any comments around that? And also, yeah, are you aware of any discussions? And Ross, I'd be interested in you too, about maybe bringing some of that learning that's obviously sitting in some parts of MB across to the Endeavour contracting crew.
Well, to answer Richard's question, no, I'm not aware of any discussions with an MB. But I don't know if there's anybody from MB watching this talk, because hopefully this sort of presentation might be the sort of thing, and people talking about it might be the sort of thing that gets them thinking about doing things differently. And that does lead into a question that Kirsty's raised down below as well, which was this question I had. And essentially I wanted to ask Ross, whose idea was it to change the contract style, MB's or Manaaki Whenua's? And if it wasn't MB's idea, how much convincing did they take to change their mind, and how long did it take?
Okay. Okay, guess Paul's and Michael. Two things. One is in terms of MB being aware of this principal based contract. Well, obviously they are in a sense of that they're the contract funder, but I did give a talk to MB around very similar to this talk, a little bit different about very much about this. And there was actually a lot of participants there, both from the Te Aroha and Future Pathways team, which essentially, in the context of today, we mean some of the key policy analysts, but also several of the teams across MB. And I understand that it's generated some discussion and quite a bit of interest. So I really hope that some people from MB are here today, and they can also look at what you've done, Aaron, because I think what you've done is actually quite applicable. In terms of how did we kick it off? So our contract came up for came up in cycle to redo. The idea came from Manaaki Whenua, and it kind of came about from two kind of key sources. One is we'd just done a strategic review of our collections and databases, and we realised that with the kind of constrained funding and other factors that we needed to address, is that the current contract as it stood was very, very constraining around being able to do strategic initiatives. If we want to digitise something, we couldn't actually kind of digitise, we can prioritise and do this thing first. We would have had to, it was very, very constraining. So that kind of set our thinking off from our end. And the other thing where it all kind of came together actually is I'd been spending a bit of time by chance talking to staff around the redoing the contract and about a few other issues, and I thought, well, actually the staff are the ones who really know this, and some of the things they were talking about were news to me, in that I'm actually my name's on the actual contract, and I thought, well, what if we could actually reflect some of those issues around the capability, around the importance of the collaborations, around what it really does take to curate? Wouldn't that be far more meaningful if we had that in the contract? So we took those gems of ideas to MB and talked about it with them. Interestingly, from their side, they came back and said, during the discussion, they were saying, it's not really working for us either, what we're currently doing. We feel like we're micromanaging, but we don't really understand what's going on. So we're not very happy either. So MB were very, it was mutually kind of agreed early on both sides that we'd like to try something a little bit different. And then the principles came out, like I said, from really interestingly from the ground up, from the staff themselves, about what it takes to do this job. So,
Ross, I just one of my reflections listening to you is it sounded much more like the note I wrote was a strategic contract, like a contract that reflects the sort of things that, like governance, you know, if you think about if anyone's familiar with the principles of governance from the Institute of Directors and things, it was much more at that level where, you know, boards of directors have to be ready to change. They have a very clear role, but that's changing all the time. And so how it was framed up was much more kind of like you might see in that kind of forum. It was, yeah, an interesting reflection from my point of view. Matt's got a question there, if you've seen, wondering about what the implications, if any, do relational and principle-based contracts have for the budgeting process? Another great question.
Like to go first, Aaron, or shall I have a crack?
Yeah, I can go. From our perspective, what we do is we agree a certain amount of funding is going to be allocated to a program of work up front, and we say, right, you've got 5 years to do this work. This is the problem that you're going to attack, and that's how much money you've got. Go away and come up with a plan on how to best tackle that problem. And so they do that, and then at the end of each year, in theory, we could cut them off, but we don't because we trust each other. But the contract says that each subsequent year's funding is subject to them producing producing an annual work plan that gets approved. Now, because we're all on the same team, we all want that as the result. So there's really no risk to anybody that we're going to cut anybody off. It might be this, if there was something that we were a bit unsure about, we'd have a conversation. But to get back to the budgeting thing, from my perspective, my budget allocates the money. From their perspective, they know that that money is going to come into them. What it gives them the ability to do is that in the first year, they've mapped out in detail their budget, and they've probably planned that out for the next 3 or 4 years as well. But as they get towards the end of the first year, they can go, you know what? There's no point pouring more money into this avenue of research because it's not working. So let's stop that. Let's shift some resources to this other new idea, or for this other idea that's this avenue that's turned out to be more productive. So I think it makes the budgeting process a bit more meaningful, I think, rather than just sort of allocating some money to a bucket and then spending that money according to a plan that you've dreamt up 5 years ago. You're actually thinking about how to best use the funds that you have available, and you've got a mandate to shift money around between bits of research. You don't have to come back to renegotiate your contract to do that. You just say, hey, this thing's not working, so we're going to do this other thing instead. Is that okay? We have a look at it and we go, yep, that's okay, and they crack on.
And Aaron, it wasn't in the absence of a process first, because you were talking about the scoping process initially, right? So there'd been a sort of a collaborative process to figure out what are the priorities, the focus, and then the budget set in behind, yeah? Yep,
so that identified what areas of work we need and gave us sort of an idea of relative priorities to divvy up our overall budget and say, well, this area is going to have this much money to spend, do the best you can with it, sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can actually provide a fairly short answer, because I'm just saying it from the funder provider perspective, which is exactly what Aaron just said, the opposite side of the funder perspective. With a SIF contract, it's set for 5 years, so we don't have that annual kind of whatever, but that sounds like that's not an issue anyway. From a budgeting perspective, I just view it, I don't have to do the individual budgeting myself, but from what I'm hoping and what I'm gathering is it's providing a lot more flexibility for how we allocate our budgets across the 7 collections and databases as a whole. And so yeah, that's probably all I would say. It's not like we've got more money, but we've got more flexibility.
Yeah. Mary, thanks for your comment about how useful this has been. That's really pleasing to hear. Linda's popped a question in around how it might involve, and Mary, please feel free to say something if you want to. All good? But yeah, Linda's asking about how this sort of filters down to the subcontractor level. Another really good question, like real practical application question. Aaron, probably best for you to address that.
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And so at the outset, we did tell people when they're subcontracting people, they need to put similar clauses to us that this piece of work is subject to the work plan being approved for the subsequent years. So that gave them the ability, should it come to it, to scale back or stop pieces of work. Now, in reality, I don't think that happened a lot. We did have one or two instances, but generally that was relatively small contracts for small pieces of work for short term. So they were exploring whether something worked, or if it didn't, they knew that was going to come to an end. The thing is, it's the subcontract, especially big subcontractors in a big program, you're all in a team together. So they're collectively working out what they're going to do with their funding and their work plan. So if it's decided an area of work should be scaled back or redirected, collectively they'll be working out where the best place to redirect that funding to is, and hopefully they're taking into account, making sure that capability is not cut off at the knees at some whim that some newfangled ideas come up, so we're going to stop and do some other thing. So it comes down back to relationships and trust again, the trust that's built within the team, as well as the trust that they have between them and us as a funder versus provider. But we didn't encounter any problems.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. We've got 1 minute to go, so I want to give both of you the final, any final reflections or comments before we close up.
One thing I would just say, I'm just looking at the even broader context than what we're talking about today. I don't know how many people are familiar with iPEN systems work we did a couple of years ago, and we kind of highlighted, I can't remember, was it 7 or 8 key areas that kind of enablers of delivery of impact, and two of them were, one was around that kind of working in partnership and trust is really important, which we're touching on today. And related to it closely, one was about funding stability and flexibility. And at the time, we were kind of going, okay, are they a little bit contradictory? I think some people were, can you have both? And I think from the experiences we're seeing today is, yes, you can actually create some funding stability and flexibility. And I think that's a really kind of like it's like a little bit of a system intervention, if you want to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah. No, I think, and actually listening to Aaron, to your sort of that little wee history lesson at the beginning, it was a nice reminder that it wasn't always like this. And sometimes we forget that, just because things have been done a certain way for, our lifetime doesn't mean that that's how it's always been done. And there's always room for adaptation and change. Yeah. Aaron, any final comments?
No, thank you everybody for their questions, and thanks, Ross, for your presentation. It was quite good to see the slightly different perspective.
I totally enjoyed yours. Yeah, it's great.
All right, well, look, a big thank you to everyone for coming on the call and listening. Normally we have another webinar ready for March, but we're just still working on that, so we'll let you know via our newsletter as soon as we've got that organised. But just a reminder as well, the link will be sent out for you all, along with copies of the slides tomorrow. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you all online again soon, I hope. Ka kite, everybody. Have a great day.